Otra vez, para interpretación en español, llame al 1-844-855-4444. El PIN es 198088. In English, we have interpretation for this call. Please call into Spanish at 1-844-855-4444. The access PIN is 198088. We want to apologize that there is no sign language interpretation, but we will have a transcription and closed caption in the next couple of days. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Cindy. And first, welcome. Thank you for everyone who's joining across the country and around the world to the Rising Majorities teach-in, movement building in the time of the coronavirus. We're just honored that folks decided to join us, to take their time out of what we know is a very busy schedule, a very intense time, to have such an important conversation about what is movement building currently in this moment. But before I get started, first let me talk to you and share a little bit about the Rising Majority for those that do not know of the Rising Majority and have not joined us yet. First, the Rising Majority is a coalition of organizations and movements across sectors committed to building a powerful, a more unified left that is committed to radical democracy, a left that is committed to a transformative vision and structural change, and is both anti-racist as well as anti-capitalist. And so we are committed, many of us, whether we're in the movement for Black Lives or the immigrant rights movement, or folks that are doing environmental justice and climate change work, we are committed to coming together to amplify our collective power and also putting forth a really transformative vision. I think we can all agree that now more than ever, we need a kind of vision that talks about the level of structural change that we need in this moment. And we organized this teach-in, which we've called Movement Building, the time of the coronavirus, because our people all over the world are under not only the challenges caused by this virus, including the terrible loss of life and the illnesses to our loved ones, but we're also suffering as a result of what it means to live under racial capitalism. A reality where the interests of corporate executives, of shareholders, and the wealthy few mean more than the billions of people and the planet of itself. And so this moment for us demonstrates why we need a transformative vision while also fighting for what people need right now in this moment. There is no doubt that we are living in a challenging moment, but we also want to say that while this is a moment of great peril, we are also living in a time and a moment of also great possibility for us to lift up the most transformative, the most powerful, bold demands of our time, and to also build the more unified, the more powerful left our people and the planet deserve. And so this is a conversation to allow us to really get into a collective assessment of what is this moment? Can we forecast out the possibilities of what's to come? And what is required of us as a left in this time? And I am so honored to be helping moderate and hold a program with some of the most powerful, brilliant, amazing thinkers and minds of our time. We're going to begin with Angela Davis and Naomi Klein. Many people know these great leaders and what they've done in terms of building such a powerful body of thought and thinking around what is required of us. But first, let me start off with Angela Davis. Many people know Angela Davis. Many of us know how much she's a powerful leader, a powerful activist, and someone whose work has impacted many of us in the US, but also all around the world. And we're also joined by Naomi Klein, an incredible activist, leader, and writer whose thinking and work has had such a profound impact on many activists and organizers around the world. So I know you all, whether you're in New York or you're in Johannesburg, South Africa, are excited to be in the company and the presence of such brilliance. And we are so grateful to be in community and to be in movement with you in this moment and in this time. So as we have this discussion, we also wanted to bring in additional comrades and leaders within the rising majority. So the program will start first with some questions and a dialogue and a discussion with Naomi Klein and Angela Davis. And then we have comrades Maurice Mitchell of the Working Families Party, Cindy Wiesner of Grassroots Global Justice, and Tran of Southern Vision Alliance, all leaders within the rising majority. We'll have a collective discussion really about how do we build the powerful left that we need in this moment. So I'd like us to now invite in Angela Davis and Naomi Klein into this discussion, into this teaching. And we'd like to start off with this first question, which is, what is your assessment of this unprecedented crisis we're living in at this moment? What does it tell us about some of the failures of capitalism in this moment and the threat of disaster capitalist solutions? So I'd like to ask you, Naomi Klein, to start by just giving us your assessment.
Sure. Well, first of all, I just want to say how thrilled I am to be with you, to be in dialogue with Angela, a hero of mine, to be with this incredible group of organizers, and to be in a global conversation. I've been hearing from people all around the world who have tuned in, some at ungodly hours. And I think it speaks to our deep desire for connection. And I think we feel that more than ever because so many of us are being denied something we've taken for granted for our whole lives, which is the ability to be in person with our comrades. And we also have to remember that at the same time, so many people do not have the luxury of quarantine, whether because they do not have homes to quarantine in or because they're being worked off their feet. So I think the quick answer to your question is that capitalism is the disaster. Yes, I've written about disaster capitalism, but this is a crisis created by capitalism. The pandemic itself is an expression of our war on nature, of diseases coming from wilderness into the human sphere, because we are encroaching onto the wilderness more and more. We are seeing in every way, we know that this disease preys on weak immune systems. We know that, that the virus does. But I think if we zoom out, what we see is that our economic system, which is so willing and indeed is built upon the willingness to sacrifice life in the interest of profit, and always has been, whether the transatlantic slave trade or whether the natural world in the face of the climate crisis, that system has created so many pre-existing conditions for this crisis to deepen, has weakened our collective immune system, and created the conditions in which this virus runs rampant. And this expresses itself in so many ways, whether the for-profit medical system in this country, in the United States, or public healthcare systems in Italy, in the UK, that have been starved by relentless austerity for decades, or whether the denigration of the work of care, which expresses itself in failing to provide protective equipment, or the denigration of this so-called service work, which is also really the work of care, which we see expressed in the way people delivering food, making food, packing boxes are treated as disposable. In every way, all of this is making the crisis, the virus spread faster and out of control. But in addition to that, we also have disaster capitalism, which means that we are seeing what we always see, this corporate opportunism that sees this pain, this need, and doesn't say, how do we solve it? How do we save lives? It says, how can I further enrich my own interests? So that is expressing itself right now with environmental regulations being suspended in China, in the United States, in the name of spurring the economy. It expresses itself in attacks on financial regulations. You know, it's the wish list that gets pushed forward under cover of crisis again and again. and also explicit attacks on our ever weakened democracy. So we see Viktor Orban in Hungary, and we see Jair Bolsonaro, and we see Benjamin Netanyahu, and we see Trump himself, all of them making these extreme power grabs for extra powers of surveillance, but in the case of Orban and Netanyahu, rule by decree with no end in sight. So that's the snapshot of what we are up against, I believe, or part of it, some glimpse.
Thank you for that, Naomi, and just appreciate you talking about sort of what are the conditions that have led us to this level, to this particular crisis, and the impact that it's having on us around the world, but also what are we up against? So appreciate that. Now I'd like to turn to you, Angela, and also to give you an opportunity to share sort of what is your assessment of the current moment? What is your assessment of what's happening? What's to come? So I'd like to turn it over to you.
Well, good afternoon. First of all, let me say that I am really honored to be in dialogue with you, Naomi, and thank you, Thenjiwe, and Barbara Ransby and Mo Mitchell and all of the other organizers from the Rising Majority who pulled this amazing teaching together. I guess the only thing I would add would be that for those of us who feel alone because we have been compelled to forego the in-person social contacts that should sustain us, that always sustained us, I think we can feel strengthened and energized by the fact that we are connected to people all over the planet who at this moment are experiencing similar conditions. And I'm thinking about, what's happening in Palestine now. I'm thinking about what's happening in Kurdistan, especially Syrian Kurdistan. I'm thinking about populations that are already subject to different modes of repression, who are much more likely to suffer during this period of failed response to the coronavirus.
Thank you for that. And I have just a follow-up conversation for you, Angela. You've taught us so much over the years around the prison industrial complex and the carceral state. And so how do we understand this moment through an abolitionist lens? There's been call for release of folks who are locked up in jails and in prisons. And so what do you make of all of this, and how, what does it mean to, as a movement, be an abolitionist, in this time?
Well, first of all, Thenjiwe, thank you very much for this question that highlights the impact of the current conditions, the virus, and the attempt to mitigate it on people who have already been forced to shelter in place. There's been so much concern about people in situations such as cruise ships where rapid transmission is inevitable. We should, of course, be even more concerned about people in jails and prisons and immigrant detention facilities. First of all, people who are in jail are generally there for a short period of time, maybe a month, 6 months. If they're doing time, it's always 1 year or less. Under the current conditions, however, a, say, 3-month sentence can be tantamount to a death sentence. Here in California, the governor has ordered no new intakes into the state system, which is a good thing. But it's possible that there will be such a backlog that the county jails will be severely overcrowded. And by the way, this would be a very appropriate time to shut down Rikers in New York. And I'm in Oakland, California now, where I live. And of course, many organizations such as critical resistance, no new jails, all of us or none, the transgender, gender variant, intersex justice project. These organizations have demanded that many prisoners be released. And it's true that thousands of prisoners have already been released, but that is just a drop in the bucket, considering that 2.3 million people are behind bars in this country. We're especially demanding the immediate release of elders in prison. But of course, when we consider the fact that imprisonment always speeds up aging, when we speak of elders, we're talking about people over 50 years old. And I know most people who are 50 don't necessarily consider themselves old in the so-called free world, but that is not the case behind bars. They're also calling for the release of all kids who are in juvenile facilities and all people who are awaiting trial. They're also demanding an end to the so-called quality of life policing, which creates the opportunity for the unnecessary arrest of so many people. And extremely important, and a halt to all operations conducted by ICE. Because I think when we speak about the prison industrial complex, it's so important to recognize that immigrant detention is in many ways at the forefront of that process. What all this should teach us is that decarceration needs to happen. Decarceration, which is an important abolitionist strategy. And it needs to happen not simply for the sake of those who are behind bars, but for the sake of everyone's health. You know, I was reading Mike Davis's article in The Jacobin, which he called the corona crisis is a monster fueled by capitalism. And he made the point that the current pandemic expands the argument. Global capitalism now appears biologically unsustainable in the absence of an international public health infrastructure. But he says, such an infrastructure will never exist until people's movements break the power of big pharma and for-profit healthcare. And I know Naomi has spoken about this, and she's the expert on disaster capitalism. We've been following your work, Naomi, for many years around that issue. So yeah, abolition, I think an abolitionist lens requires us to think broadly and to remember, for example, that there are those who are unhoused. Even if we do succeed in the effort to engage in decarceration of vast numbers of people who are behind bars, many of those who leave jails or prisons will have only the street as a site to shelter in place. And that shelter in place order incorporates a logic that assumes that people have houses and that people have money for food and also the means with which to stay in connection with others. Many, those in prison, those who've been released, don't have that luxury. So this leads us to talk about the need for accessible and free housing and food. If Iran could release 70,000 prisoners out of 240,000, that's approximately 1/3 of its prison population, the US should be able to follow suit, which means authorities should release at least 765,000 people from custody at this moment.
Thank you for that, Angela. And you've transitioned us really well as you sort of talk about what is the most bold, powerful demands that we need to be lifting up in this moment as it relates to all of our people in the U.S. and around the world. And this sort of transitions to the next question, which I'd love for you, Naomi, to start, which is, how have we gotten a glimpse of what is possible through this crisis? We've just talked about our assessment and the context of the current conditions, but, what is possible, and also like what is required of us in this moment?
Well, a great deal is required of us in this moment, especially because we are only in the early stages of this tremendous crisis. I think the lesson of the moment is that once you recognize that you are in an emergency, a great deal is possible. And so many of us, on this call, in this conversation and listening in, have spent their lives trying to convince the rest of the world, powerful interests, that the status quo is an emergency. Whether it is mass incarceration, whether it is absolutely untenable levels of inequality and injustice, whether it is our war on nature. What gets declared an emergency is an expression of power. And in the United States, what we saw is actually a fair amount of pushback in the early days. And this is a big part of the reason why the US is as unprepared as it was. They didn't see it as a crisis. They didn't see it as an emergency. And a lot of people said out loud on Fox News and outlets like it that they actually just thought old people and sick people should just quietly die in the name of the stock market. And I think the only reason why there has been an emergency mobilization, even though it has been inadequate in the face of this crisis, I think honestly has a lot to do with the geographic travels of this virus, in the sense that it sort of hit parts of the world that frankly had a stronger social fabric before it hit the United States. And so we had precedents from China, from Southern Europe, where economies were shut down to save lives, and that kind of forced the hand of the Trump administration. I honestly don't know whether they ever would have done it if it hadn't hit Southern Europe first and they had been forced in this way. So crisis blows open the sense of what is possible, right? When I wrote the shock doctrine and quoted Milton Friedman, and now it gets quoted a lot, that only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. And when the crisis occurs, it depends on what ideas are lying around, right? That quote, and some of you may have heard me say that, the reason why Milton Friedman was as focused on having an intellectual infrastructure of disaster preparedness for the right, for the corporations, is because he understood that when capitalism produces its own crises and the injustices of the system are laid bare for all to see, as happened during the Great Depression, it is actually a huge opportunity for the left. And Milton Friedman wrote in a letter to Augusto Pinochet in the 70s that he said, "I believe that everything went wrong in your country as well as mine in the 1930s, when people got the idea that they could do good things with other people's money." So in other words, the whole strategy that they are deploying in order to move so quickly in the face of crisis to push forward their wish list is because they are afraid that we will push ours. They are afraid that we will demand precisely what Angela has been talking about, that we empty the jails, that we demand homes for all, that we say, wait a minute, you had a spare $6 trillion? We could do a damn good start of a Green New Deal with that, right? I mean, if you can pay people to stay home, you can pay people to retrain out of the fossil fuel sector, right? If corporations are on their knees asking for bailouts, the highest polluting sectors on the planet, oil companies, gas companies, airlines, car companies, cruise ship companies, that means that we can take ownership over these sectors. We can wind them down if they are at war with life on Earth. We can take care of their workers. So we need to quote my colleagues at the LEAP, which is an organization that I co-founded, our job is to kick open the door of radical possibility as wide and as long as possible. And I think, the work that you have been doing, Thenjiwe, and the movement for Black Lives all of these years, we are in a better position in this crisis than we were the last time the global economy collapsed in 2008, when we were very clear that we were being forced to pay for the crisis of the bankers, and we occupied squares and we said no. And I know there are people listening in from Southern Europe who were part of the movement of the squares and went on to form Podemos. But in that moment, we didn't put forward our radical alternatives with enough courage, with enough power. And that is what we need to do. And I am so inspired by the workers at Amazon and Whole Foods and Instacart and GE and the nurses and all the frontline workers who now realize how essential they are, despite having had their labor so denigrated that some of them are having to wear literally garbage bags to protect themselves from this virus. That is how capitalism sees them, literally as trash, are standing up and saying, no, 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 we hold the world up. And that's the energy that we need to be building on, that kind of worker power. And we are going to have to be exercising our right to stop, to withhold that labor, and we need to be supporting those workers in every possible way that we can. So that's, sorry, I'm ranting, but like, we need to kick the door open, keep it open.
One, it's inspiring. But I know this thing that you're saying to us is like, we need to be bold, we need to be confident to put forward the most transformative, bold demands, but also expand the realm of possibility in our imaginations, because we're learning that what we thought perhaps was not possible before is clearly possible now. And so how are we putting forward the highest level of demands that really stretches sort of radical imagination, and it sort of real powerful, perception of what's possible in this time.
If I could just add one more thing, it's a race against time. It's a race against time because we haven't seen their worst ideas yet. Angela mentioned Gaza. Folks in Gaza have been telling us for years that they're a laboratory for the rest of the world. The first corona cases were diagnosed in a Mumbai slum today. Okay, that's very worrying, because what Angela is saying is true about people's inability to shelter in place when you don't have a shelter. But what does a carceral state do in response to that? What does a Modi do? What does a Duterte do? What does a Bolsonaro do? It seals in the slum, right? It turns it into Gaza, okay? So unless we are out here saying, no, everybody has a right to a home, there's a lot of empty hotels out there, we will see a lot worse than we're seeing now.
Yeah, and I think that's why we have to frame this also as like, what is required of us in this moment? And I'd like to turn it over to you before we open it up to the other comrades on this in this teach-in is just, Angela, if you could share, what do you believe is required of us in this moment, and what has been made, what is possible, what is clearly possible for us to understand and inform the level of action and movement that we choose to do in this moment. So I'd like to invite you in to share just some of your thoughts.
Well, I absolutely agree with Naomi that we should think about the similarities between the era of the 1930s and the present. And I think that many people are recognizing how unequipped capitalism is to truly serve the needs of people and other beings on the planet. The reason there's such a healthcare crisis is precisely because of the privatization process that began in the 1980s, which is the same era that saw the rise of the prison industrial complex. Hospitals now largely operate under the profit mandates of capital, and empty beds are not profitable. Stockpiles of equipment from ventilators to masks are not compatible with the just-in-time production. So global capitalism is really responsible for the inability to address this pandemic. It's also responsible for the vast numbers of people in prison and in detention facilities, and for the high cost of healthcare and housing and education. And I think people have the capacity to realize that it did not have to happen this way. That healthcare does not have to be treated as a commodity to be bought and sold, that people don't have to be in prison simply because there's no place for them in the current economy. But I also want to point out that the crisis is revealing the nature of racial capitalism. From the racism directed against Asian Americans, following the lead of what's his name, the current occupant of the White House, to the failure to provide testing kits to hospitals and clinics in Black neighborhoods. Asian Americans have been spit at and yelled at and physically attacked. And in places like the McHarris Medical College in Nashville, Tennessee, which had set up for testing, there was a severe delay because they were not provided with the tests. I think that we are recognizing, and we have the capacity to organize against the structural racism that drives our institutions, the everyday racism. And I think that we have the capacity to do feminist organizing, what we might call abolition feminist organizing, because all of these are feminist issues. Racism is a feminist issue. Homelessness is a feminist issue. Prison abolition is a feminist issue. And, but I think that, that we should take into consideration the fact that so many of the people who are at the center of this crisis, on the front lines of this crisis, are women. Women of all racial and ethnic backgrounds, poor women, trans women, women especially in the countries of the global South. And so I think that we should seize upon this as an opportunity to do the kind of organizing that enhances the sense of a need for international solidarity. This has the capacity to perhaps bring us out of our US-centric slumber, and to recognize that we can take leadership from people who are organizing in other parts of the world, domestic workers all over the world who are now losing their job, of course, because of the stay-at-home orders, those who care for people in the for-profit nursing industries, such the nursing home industry, such as the outbreak that happened in Washington. And I just want to say one thing about gender violence and child abuse, because it seems that the whole notion of staying at home is assumed to imply that we can retreat to this kind of nurturing environment, this refuge. But for many, they're being forced to spend 24 hours a day with their abusers. unable to connect with those who have been their lifelines, and children and women who are abused. I think that this isn't, we should seize upon this as an opportunity to do the kind of organizing that is going to enhance our sense of belongingness to the world, and enhance our sense of the possibility of moving beyond capitalism.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Angela. And just, you know, it's so important that we don't disappear. The most vulnerable of us, particularly in this moment, whether it's frontline workers or children in homes and folks who are survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. And that in this moment, what is required is that we see the full range of our people and how they're hurting in this moment and how are we centering them. And just want to, as we sort of move to open up this panel to include some of the other comrades, just want to thank the both of you for both naming sort of what is your assessment of the current condition of obviously coronavirus, but the product of racial capitalism and how it's led us here, and also talking with us about what is the opportunities and the possibilities that our movement must seize in order to not just meet the demands of the current moment, but also to be prepared and ready for what's to come. And so just want to appreciate that. And I really see this as a call to action to all of us on this call right now of what is required of us in this moment. So I'd like to invite in 3 other panelists and comrades within the Rising Majority that are leaders within the Rising Majority. Cindy Wiesner of Grassroots Global Justice, Maurice Mitchell of the Working Families Party, and Lone Tran of Southern Vision Alliance. I just want to say, we know that people across the country and the world are watching right now. To follow this conversation, please use the hashtag online, the Rising Majority. Rising Majority, the hashtag Rising Majority to follow discussion. And if you would like to sort of be connected to get updates, please text Majority to 90975. So again, thank you everyone for joining. Thanks to the additional 3 comrades and panelists for joining us. We just started to talk about this global perspective of how coronavirus is impacting the globe, how the response of coronavirus is impacting people internationally. And so Cindy, I'd like to pose this next question to you, which is, what else do we need to be thinking about or paying attention to in this moment as we look to what's happening around the world? So Cindy, I'll hand it off to you to share some of your thinking on this.
All right, saludos a todas y todex. Really honored to be in this dialogue, in this conversation. I think to pick up on a couple of points that Angela and Naomi made, Antonio Gramsci, along with Friedman, writes a lot about crisis. And the crisis, it either gives us an opportunity to do something, or it gives the right wing an opportunity. And I feel that we have the opportunity to break the back of global neoliberalism, or we look into a future of further authoritarianism or fascism. It's an opportunity for us to rethink the reorganization of society on a global level, from the very local, from neighborhood, all the way to our territories and to across the world. And we have to be able to, at this moment, really reimagine and rethink and make sure that in this moment of so much deep trauma and hopelessness, that we don't lose that radical imagination. There are people living across the world and inside the United States in dire conditions with no access to water, no electricity, precarity. And part of what we're also seeing hand in hand, we will see deep levels of repression and the curbing of democracy and democratic rights with the use of militarization. And I think this is one of those moments. Not only are we making those immediate demands about masks and ventilators and funds to hospitals and to grocery workers, we have to also take a stand against no war, no militarization, and stopping the occupation. We need to end the sanctions. Sanctions already were slow deaths. People are gonna die not only of coronavirus, but they're gonna die of hunger. And we need to be in solidarity now more than ever with people from Iran, from Venezuela, from North Korea, from Cuba, Palestine, Zimbabwe, and the 30 other countries that have sanctions against them. Number two, I think it's an opportunity for us to really think about how many movements around the world have been experimenting with alternatives to capitalism, that have really thought about the needs. Social movements have been putting out food sovereignty as an alternative, food production, right? Small farmers cool the planet is what La Via Campesina says. Feminist economy, the vibrant feminist movement around the world that has been in motion, that has been at the forefront of authoritarianism, has been talking about the need for a feminist economy. Environmentalists, indigenous peoples have been talking about, EJ communities have been talking about a regenerative economy. Indigenous peoples in the Andes talking about buen vivir, and different experiments around socialism of the 21st century. And I think it's a moment for us to be able to say, we need desperately an alternative to this capitalist, colonialist, patriarchal, racist, ableist system. And we've been working, and all of our movements across the world have been working on those alternatives. We know how to be able to serve the needs of people and center life in a very different way. And I think that's one of the things that movements around the world are talking about. How do we center, now that home has become the site of struggle, as Angela said, it's also the site of hope, but it's also a moment where reproductive labor has automatically become so visible, right? From our homes to our communities to our workplaces. Reproductive labor of folks that do service are now at the forefront of saving the planet. And I think that one of the things that I think we need to really think about is this moment to dismantle the neoliberal patriarchal system that we live in, because the responses of Trump and Bolsonaro and Duterte have all been patriarchal approaches to the crisis. And I think that we need to be able to understand that ultimately we have the solutions. The people who got us into this mess are not going to take us out of it. And we have the opportunity to be those defenders of life and territories and knowledge, and know that we have an alternative. So there's a couple of places that I think around the world that there's been very clear demands starting to be articulated to end the sanctions now. The second one is to cut military budgets from the local on up, all the way to the national, to the local, to the statewide. And then three, there's been this bailout, being able to not bail out corporations and CEOs and transnational corporations, but to actually bail out the people, because we're in a moment where that is what is intention. And I think that we need to be able to do that. We need to support homes for all. We need to support services and relief effort for undocumented people, for all people. We need to be able to repeal the authorization use of military force. And we need to be able to talk about what is it that we want, not just what we're against, but this is the moment more than ever to talk about what we want.
Thank you so much, Cindy. And thanks for just like centering how critical international solidarity is, but really like that victory only happens at the product of global movement building in this moment, that we only achieve a radical realignment of power. We only achieve an end to racial capitalism if we build the type of global movement around the world that is able and ready to drastically realign power as it is. So you brought up a number of different things, from the need to center the people and not corporate executives, not the corporations, not financial institutions. So I want to bring in Maurice Mitchell with the Working Families Party into this conversation. Many people have talked about the stimulus bill and how it centered the needs of financial institutions and corporations and not necessarily the needs of the people. And so we need to talk about sort of who's in office. And this is an election year. And so can you share a little bit about sort of what are the implications of this pandemic for this election? And can you speak about any other sort of thinking that you have around what do we need to consider as it relates to who's in office, elections, and the current moment that we're in?
Sure, thank you. Thank you so much, Thenjiwe. And it's an honor to be in conversation with Cindy Wiesner, Lone Tran, Naomi Klein, and Angela Davis. So I just really appreciate being in conversation at this time of crisis. To answer your question, the implications are profound. Now, traditionally, movement organizers have built power, electoral power or otherwise, through face-to-face conversations, at the doors, through, canvassing at the doors, or in our communities, either small groups of people coming together or mass rallies, right? We have conversations, we build connections, we build relationships. Relationships are the most basic building block of our movements. And now we can't build relationships in the same way because we have to shelter in place and we have to observe social distancing in order to save our lives and save the lives of people in our community. So we must adapt. And we are adapting by engaging in all means of communication in order to talk to our folks, using texting and calling folks and digital organizing like we're doing right now. We're using color codes on our doors or on our windows to communicate our needs and whether or not we're safe. Can't hold a traditional rally? Well, we could hold a Zoom call with tens of thousands of people like we're doing right now. Or we could raise our voices out our windows like many people are doing around the world. This is the moment when we're going to have to adapt and we're gonna have to innovate in order to continue to build the bonds of our relationships, even as we're isolated. We're isolated, but we're certainly not alone. And this is a moment when people on the far right and Republicans are calling for universal basic income. And at the same time, they're calling for having grandparents essentially sacrifice themselves for the market. And so what that demonstrates to me is that the logic of neoliberal capitalism is no longer making sense in this moment, and that organized capital and the folks in Washington that prop them up are in disarray. And they'll do what's necessary in order to prop up the system. And if that incidentally means providing some people relief, so be it. So this is a moment when our political leadership and our clarity is so critical. Now, the Working Families Party and many of our allies are developing these new tactics for the moment because we cannot retreat in this moment. Now more than ever, and we've already heard from the previous speakers, we need leaders that are accountable to working people, and not just in the United States, but globally, right? And there's gonna be a tug of war between the interests of corporations and the interest of working people. And so social movements and people coming from social movements could play a critical role in filling that gap, which is why we need more and more people on the local and statewide level who are coming from social movements and accountable to social movements running for office. So some folks might question whether or not that's true, that whether or not the energy of the left is better spent in doing direct action or building mass movements, and we shouldn't waste our time with elections in this moment. But what we're seeing play out, I think, underscores why building electoral power is crucial in this moment. Imagine, if you will, if Donald Trump were not president. The federal response would look very different. We could measure that in hundreds of thousands of lives. To use a more local example, Governor Kemp in Georgia has utterly failed to grapple with this pandemic, and people are going to die because of his response. Now, just let that sink in for a moment. People are going to die because an election was stolen from Stacey Abrams in 2018. So given that, we understand that elections aren't our only strategy in this moment. We need strikes, rent strikes, mortgage strikes, strikes of essential workers, like Naomi talked about, like the workers who are gallantly striking, Amazon and Instacart workers and others. We need mutual aid on the ground, and we're seeing a lot of that. We need protest movements making bold demands and offering inspiring, soul-affirming solutions to people who desperately need them. But we also need to translate all of that into electoral consequences. Working people must seize all levels of power, and working people, we simply don't have the luxury to leave any tool on the table, including electoral tools. And that's why we have to make sure that democracy actually continues. And when I say democracy, I mean, we need to ensure that true democracy, radical democracy, blooms in this moment, right? So not just election day, but 365 days of the week, civil society fully blooming in this moment. And this is a very fragile and uncertain moment, and nothing is given. Authoritarians around the world will mimic each other. And we need to ensure that the right wing in our country does not use this moment as an opportunity in order to snuff the little semblance of democracy we have left. And so, we could look at what's already taken place in Hungary, and I guarantee you, Donald Trump is paying attention. And so we have to be vigilant. We have to wake ourselves up from the dream of American exceptionalism. This is truly a global movement. I'll just end by saying that, the current coronavirus outbreak and the shelter-in-place efforts, I think what they've really exposed is a need for a massive expansion of our democracy and the voter infrastructure. So specifically, we're engaging in campaigns around a concept where all Americans should be able to vote from home. We think that that is just common sense in a moment where we might not be able to physically leave our homes. And we need to ensure that all Americans have their ballots mailed to them in enough time where they could return those ballots in a number of ways. So that's just one concrete solution that could ensure that people are able to be heard in November. So big moments like this are exactly what needs to happen during great political realignments. But, and it's already been spoken how they could swing either way. I think Rising Majority, Working Families Party, and our allies in the movement, we need to build a multiracial coalition in this country that we've never seen before. Or the corporate right-wing, white supremacist alliance will use this crisis to further entrench their power. Every year, we reach out to millions of Americans around voting for progressives, and that's on the hyper-local level all the way up, because we understand that these reigns of power actually really matter for our folks. And we're gonna continue to do that, and we need to figure out new ways of doing it and broadening that appeal to the millions and millions and millions of people who are trying to make sense of this moment. This is not simply a moment for folks on the left to talk to other people who are self-identified leftists. This is opportunity for left solutions to inspire the entire country. And so I just want to close really quickly just to encourage everybody to go to the Rising Majority website, where there's actual solutions and steps that people could take from the Working Families Party and other folks to get involved. For example, we're building an army of volunteer texters who could text from home in order to engage people all around the country. And I invite folks to join the movement and join the other organizations at the Rising Majority that are doing the work that we will need in order to weave together that coalition.
Thank you so much for that, Mo. And now I'd like to bring in you, Lone, into the conversation, and then we'll end this with one last question to all the panelists. But we were committed to building the Rising Majority and build, because we believe we need to build an anti-racist left committed to radical democracy. And so, I know, Lone, that your work is broader than this, but can you say a few words about the ways in which xenophobia and anti-Asian racism is playing out during this crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Thenjiwe, and thanks to the other panelists who are part of this teach-in, really appreciating this dialogue. Trump's anti-Asian and specifically anti-Chinese rhetoric in this moment, calling COVID-19 a foreign virus or a Chinese virus, has been obviously very unapologetic and uncensored. And on a basic level, we know that this kind of rhetoric says it doesn't matter if Asian people die from this pandemic. But what this kind of rhetoric also says about Asian people is that it's okay if our people are the casualties of imperialist wars, the casualties of climate disasters and environmental extraction, the casualties of occupation and neocolonialism, both within the US borders and those asserted by the US empire all around the world. It's okay if Asian people are the casualties of unpaid work, of exploitation, of hunger, of solitary confinement, of housing insecurity. And so I hope now that it's really clear for all of those of us who are who are coming into movement, that this kind of anti-Asian rhetoric also lays the basis and justification for social and economic policy, which doesn't only kill Asian people, it kills all of us. And as others have already spoken to this, especially those of us who were already vulnerable before this crisis, who are living in occupied communities, who are living inside of prisons and detention centers, who are living, with the reality of unlivable wages and dilapidated schools and facing police sirens and ICE agents. And so what I'm trying to say here is that Trump's anti-Asian racism is quite insidious. And unfortunately, it's hardly a new move from the playbook, right? We know that these social and economic policies that will emerge from this crisis, unless we organize and organize like hell, will only continue to exacerbate the realities of a totally gutted infrastructure, of a democracy which currently only works for the rich, and that is anchored by an increasingly fascistic government. We know that the anti-Asian racism and xenophobia being championed by Trump and his administration reveals what the real crisis is. It's capitalism, it's racial capitalism, where white supremacy and anti-Blackness and racism are the bedrock. And the othering and demonizing of Asian people in this particular moment, it's a maneuver by the elite that we've seen before to hide what is actually truly unacceptable, that right now, multinational corporations like Amazon can use racism to protect themselves and receive the massive bailouts from the so-called free market, continue to profit while our people are forced to simply wait and die. And so we've seen this kind of othering and xenophobia before. It faces our Muslim sisters and brothers. It faces our undocumented loved ones. It faces Black, brown, and indigenous kin all across the country, which was built upon, you know, some really murderous interpretations of who belongs where and who belongs to whom. And so whatever we do, we really have to remember that it's not the fault of Asian people, it's not the fault of Black people and people of color, of migrants, of women, of workers, that we're facing a global pandemic. We have to point our fingers at the right targets. We have to hold these institutions accountable, and we have to really build power to unseat the institutions which unreasonably get to determine whether our people get to live or die. And so I think it's fairly simple at the end of the day that COVID-19 is the virus, capitalism is the crisis, and our organizing and our solidarity is the answer. And so I just want to punctuate again that, you know, for anyone who really wants to throw down, who wants to deepen the struggle in this moment and beyond, to check out The Rising Majority, you can go to www.therisingmajority.org to sign up for updates and actions. You can also text SQUAD UP to 90975. And for those who are connected to organizations, we'll be hosting some information soon in the future. I think everything that folks have named, releasing prisoners, livable wages, housing for all, that is now the floor. It is not the ceiling. So what's the new ceiling going to be? And we're really hoping to fight for that with the Rising Majority. So we'll hope that folks will join us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lone. So this brings us towards sort of the close of this teach-in. And I want to invite in Angela Davis and Naomi Klein back into the conversation. I mean, we've heard a lot, again, in terms of what is happening, what are we up against, but also what is required of us in this moment. What is the type of power we need to build? So just want to turn it over to you for any sort of final words and message to the activists, the thousands of activists that are tuned in right now, the Rising Majority leaders, the organizers, folks on the front lines. If you can, share any sort of final words that you have for all of us that are looking for what is required of us in this moment. What is leadership? What does power look like? So Naomi, perhaps I'll start with you, and then we'll go to Angela Davis. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. Well, first of all, just thank you to Mo and Lone and Cindy for those fantastic ideas and display of real leadership for this moment. A couple thoughts. A lot of what I know about the transformative power of crisis, I learned from living in Argentina. After Argentina's economy collapsed in 2001, and they went through 5 presidents in 3 weeks, and everything collapsed and people started building something new in the rubble. And one of the things that I witnessed and really changed me was a movement of factories that were being abandoned by their owners, being turned into workers' cooperatives. And I raise that because when we talk about international solidarity, and I really appreciate Cindy talking about how we need to learn from the leadership in the global South and from indigenous communities in the global North, from the food sovereignty movement. We also need to learn from the factory occupation movement, because there is going to be a collapse of small businesses. And if we don't want to end up in a world where Jeff Bezos is the last man standing, then what needs to happen is that workers who are working at restaurants that are closing and nail salons that are closing and all kinds of businesses that are closing have the right to take over those workplaces and turn them into cooperatives. I think that's part of what we need to be fighting for. There's legislation that this is part of what a people's bailout means. So I just want to throw that out there. One other idea that I think is important is I think there's incredible digital organizing going on right now. One of the things we're seeing is that we have a right to the internet. It is a public utility, but right now it is in the hands of a few very large corporations. And when we talk about repression and we talk about authoritarian responses to this crisis, that includes the ability, unfortunately, to unilaterally shut down our organizing when we're organizing on corporate platforms. So we need to be aware of that and we need to be ready for it. You know, if we look at what has happened in India under Modi and just locking down Kashmir's you know, access to the internet, we need to be able to find each other without Mark Zuckerberg's permission. And there's lots of different ways that that needs to manifest, but I think it needs to be front of mind. At the same time as we fight for a true digital commons as part of the transformation we need. I want to shout out the People's Bailout. People can go to that website. The Green Stimulus, people can check that out. I mentioned the leap.org. These are organizations that are putting forward some really key frameworks, and other people have mentioned other ones. Let's remember a couple of things that a lot of us are realizing. One, we miss each other. So even as we spend a lot of time on screens, I think at the other end of this, you know, personally, I'd like to spend less time on screens and more time in community and in face-to-face. And I want to live in a world that makes that easier and more possible. Let's remember the love that we feel for caregivers. And let's build an economy that values and lifts up and is rooted in the need for us to care for one another. Let's remember the solace that we've taken in nature in the midst of all of this in the spring. And let's build an economy that is about taking care of each other and taking care of the planet. It is possible to do. It will take all the tools that Mo mentioned, the rent strikes, the debt strikes, maybe even a general strike. I don't think it will have a hashtag, so we're gonna have to figure out ways of organizing that are not brought to us by Silicon Valley. One of the things that that is hardest about this crisis is having a 7-year-old and teaching him to be afraid of people because everybody's got germs. And that is the exact opposite of the lesson that I try to teach him and that I think we all know, and that what this has all been about, which is that we are all we have. And as people try to turn us against each other, we have to remember that. And even as we isolate, we must reach towards each other and build maximum power because everything's on the line.
Thank you, Naomi. We must reach for each other. Angela, I'd love for you to share some words to all those that are listening and with us right now as we close this program.
Well, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to have this exchange. I have learned a great deal in this last hour, and I'm aware of the fact that that people are watching from other parts of the world. And I'm asking myself whether we can create similar conversations involving people from Africa, from South America, from India, of course. I'm thinking about the fact that in Brazil, the situation is far worse than it is here. And I'm not going to talk about the similarities between the two leaders. But I do think that we in the United States can find leadership from people in places like Brazil and South Africa who are searching to creatively address this crisis. What I keep coming back to is the fact that we are at this moment compelled to live within the boundaries of nation states. But nation states no longer function in a way that helps enhance our lives. As a matter of fact, the nation state is becoming increasingly obsolete. And this is what we're seeing during this crisis. So I'm really looking forward to international, global conversations and organizing. And I think that these kinds of conversations should happen over and over. Digital organizing, yes. And we need to be prepared to hit the ground running when we're finally able to be in contact with each other in person. We're going to need to organize massive demonstrations and movements and supporting. We're going to have to support all of the strikes, and we're going to have to try to create lasting formations that will assist us in moving away from this capitalist monster and toward a better future. So thank you very much, Naomi. Thank you, Thenjiwe. Thank you, Cindy and Mo and Lone and all of the others who are behind this event in Rising Majority.
Thank you so much, Angela. And thank you for always reminding us that we need to be both, have a global analysis, but also be global thinking in our organizing. And that we need to continue to have these discussions, that we need to expand it so that we're engaging with movement leaders from Brazil to South Africa. And so thank you for that. And also, clearly for everyone watching, this is a moment of learning, this is a moment of growing, but this is also a call to action. We are in a moment of crisis, but we are also in a moment that is requiring us to be our boldest, most powerful selves. And at our footsteps in this moment, we have the opportunity, but also we have the requirement and the demand to be more unified, to be more aligned, and to work in such deep, powerful strategy together to build the movement not only our children and our planet deserve, but our children yet to be born. So thank you everyone for being here with us from all around the world. Thank you to the very brilliant, the very extraordinary Naomi Klein and Angela Davis for sharing your brilliance. Thank you to the comrades Maurice Mitchell, Cindy Wiesner, Lone Tran for bringing forth just the analysis and the perspective, but again, the call to action. Want to ask everybody who's joining with us to continue to follow this conversation online. We need to be in community. We need to practice love, but we also need to find each other. So use the hashtag Rising Majority to follow more conversations and more teach-ins. If you want to be connected, if you want to get digital updates, text majority to 90975. Again, majority to 90975. And also go to therisingmajority.com to just stay up to date with what's happening. I just want to say, we know that people are scared. We know that people are dealing with just the challenge of this moment, and that we know that what will aid us is each other, is to reach for each other. What will aid us is community. What will aid us is the love that we have for each other. And what will aid us in this time is knowing just how powerful we are. And so thank you for joining. We will see you out soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye.